Hello, I am Jan Oberg. I'm the director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research in Lund, Sweden. And in the next roughly 30 minutes, I have promised to speak about, over the title, the Balkans and the purpose of NATO. And let me say I do that with a particular joy, because I am partly educated in Yugoslavia, and I'm sorry to say to begin with, I'm not going to define the Balkans. I'm going to focus on Yugoslavia as it existed and what it is today after the dissolution in the 90s. And I see it as my third country, born in Denmark, living most of my time in Sweden, but also having lived third most in Yugoslavia, particularly because I was educated there from 1974 and onwards, and because I was with my foundation and colleagues and conflict mitigation teams strongly involved in all the years of the dissolution wars in the 90s, which started out in 1991, but the conflict started much earlier. That led to the split up of Yugoslavia. I would also like to point out that my foundation has produced what is probably the largest analytical work about Yugoslavia and what happened in the 90s when Yugoslavia disappeared and was fragmented into Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Serbia, Macedonia, Kosovo, etc. It's called Yugoslavia, What Should Have Been Done. It is on our homepage, transnational.live, and it was produced while it happened, not afterwards, as so many researchers do when they know the results. We wrote things while it took place and published it all, which is equal to 2,300 A4 pages, in that blog, Yugoslavia, What Should Have Been Done. So those who are interested particularly in Yugoslavia and what it meant to the world and to Europe and to itself, can go there if they want to study it more deeply, with a rather different view from anything you would read in the Western media even today about what happened then, 30 years back in time. I have taken off my watch now because I have promised not to speak for more than 2 hours, so I better control myself. That said, Yugoslavia, or that space, what is today called Western Balkans by some people, which I think is wrong, is still among the most complex conflict formations anywhere in the world. I used to say to my students, if you can understand Yugoslavia, you will be able to understand, I'm talking about Yugoslavia because that's what it was, but it's the area that now consists of the other countries for the younger people who are watching this little lecture. I used to say that if you can understand that, the complexity of it, then you'll understand most of the conflicts in the world, be able to. It was 6 republics, 2 autonomous provinces, 3 religions, any number of nationalities, any numbers of mixtures, and they were living all over this space, which meant that it was basically impossible to split it up in republics, which was anyhow done with the marvelous disservice of the Western world, NATO and others, who obviously saw it fit to split a country, help split a country, rather than trying to keep it together and help the people and the nations living in former Yugoslavia to live peacefully together. Anybody who takes an ethnic map of former Yugoslavia will see that it's a leopard skin. It is an extremely complex thing, also because of a constitution of more than 300 pages at the time, enormous historic complexities, traumas from the Second World War. It was also a country with 3 or 4 different types of economies on the same space, on the same territory. It had 3 to 4 different defense systems, including everybody had weapons at home in a civil defense mode, but also national defense, of course. It abstained from having nuclear weapons. It abstained from the Warsaw Pact, and being a NATO member, Milovan Djilas, Europe's absolutely most important and first so-called dissident, who broke with Tito, the head of the Yugoslavia, and wrote the book in, I think, 1957 called The New Class, a classic. A man I happened to meet a couple of times before he died in his flat in Belgrade, was the one who negotiated with Stalin to secure that Yugoslavia would not be in any camp, would be a neutral country, east-west, between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, but also neutral between North and South, because it was a member of the non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement was basically, you know, the third world, the developing world at the time. And also it was a formidable member of Europe. So you can probably say that Yugoslavia, not probably say, you can say that Yugoslavia was definitely unique. There was nothing like Yugoslavia anywhere in the world. And it was a very creative, very different, very experimentative, and also very complex, and of course in the long run probably you could say impossible to keep together, because there's so many centrifugal forces also, and that has to do with international affairs of which it was a part. So very rich and very complex, very difficult. And what Yugoslavia lacked in the early 90s when war started, the conflict started 10, 20 years before that, developing, but violence was introduced in 1991 in a small place called Pakrac in Croatia. What it needed would have been somebody who could help them to either keep together, negotiate, mediate, or help them to split up in republics in a peaceful way, for instance, through referendum instead of fighting each other. But there were no conflict doctors, there were no good lawyers, there were only countries around it, east, west, north and south, who tried to exploit it, sided with one side against the others, the Western world against the Serbs. Russia not able to, because it had broken down, not able to really support the Serbs. And the Serbs were the largest group, and the Serbs were predictably, I said that even before the war started, they will be the people of all the peoples who will suffer most, because they had minorities in all the other republics. Interestingly enough, also historically, the Western world in the dissolution years of the 90s sided with those parties who were on the wrong side in the Second World War, that is with Hitler, which the Ustasha regime in Croatia was, the Muslims in Bosnia and the Kosovo Albanians. They were with Nazis and fascists and Mussolini and Hitler. Whereas, I'm not saying all the people, but the leadership. Whereas the Serbs were the one who were hammered down, killed in Croatian concentration camps in Jasenovac, together with Jews and Romas. But somehow the West decided to cast the Serbs, Serb people and Serb leadership in Belgrade in the role of the bad mini-Russians that we are always ready to fight, the bad Orthodox Christians. No matter what actually was done or not done, it was a black and white image of the Serbs against the rest, which had nothing to do with the reality for those of us who knew the history, were at the place and tried to understand all sides, which I'm one of those who have tried to. So Yugoslavia did not break down because of atavistic hatred between the peoples or something like that, all this nonsense you can read in some books, and of course at the time in the media. Yugoslavia broke down because of economics. It had been a formidable growth economy, up to 5–10% national gross national product growth in the 50s, 60s and early 70s. Then came the oil crisis in the early 70s. Then came something that hit Yugoslavia hard, that Western companies decided to relocate production to low-wage countries in Asia. So advanced production in Yugoslavia of cars and helicopters, French, German, etc., plus the very important shipbuilding industry that Yugoslavia had a lot of income from, and electronics, all this disappeared to Asia, to the low-wage countries such as whatever, South Korea or Malaysia, Philippines or whatever. Meaning that basically the industrial sector of Yugoslavia stopped working. And that meant a lot in terms of employment, income, etc. So slowly but surely, which it had not had since it rebuilt itself after the Second World War, it accumulated a rather large debt. And so, you know, when there's less and less food, so to speak, to eat, you have more of a chance to, or more of a risk that people get at each other and say, it's your fault that I'm not having a nice life as I had before. So, secondly, what had happened with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact was that some people said you cannot be neutral when there are not two parties to be neutral between, which is, of course, nonsense, because neutrality is much more than just being equidistant from some blogs, but that's another story I shall not go into. The long story short is neutrality became much more difficult, as it also did for Austria and Sweden, etc. You were forced to consider joining the alliance and the culture that survived and triumphed after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, that is socialism, communism. And since Yugoslavia was a communist system, however, with a communist party in each republic, 6 of them, very different in a way, but it was a communist party system, then you got into all these structural, historical, value-oriented problems. And when you are there, and you can press buttons of traumas with almost all the different nationalities from the Second World War, then you risk that you start these, you know, personal things, group things against other groups. And that was why everybody said at the time, media and many scholars, Yugoslavia is about ethnicities that get at each other's throat. Now, that is very, very much of a simplification. I would say it was by no means at the root an ethnic conflict. It was much more ethnicity used as a tool when the structure of it, when the legal structure, the political structure, the economic structure of former Yugoslavia successively broke down, also broke down because Marshal Tito, who was the president and basically the inspiring world leader of that country, had died 10 years earlier, if I remember correctly, in 1980. And everybody had predicted that when Tito dies, Marshal Joseph Broz Tito dies, it'll all fall apart. Now, it took 10 years before it actually fell apart. So there were many, many structural, dynamical, historical, individual things, and economy, and politics, and law, that caused the dissolution of Yugoslavia, but also its international relations vis-a-vis the Western world and the Eastern world that basically didn't exist because it had fallen apart and the Berlin Wall had come down and all that. So, saying that this was an ethnic conflict and it was just Serbs hating Croats and Croats hating Muslims and Muslims hating Serbs and Serbs hating Muslims and Serbs hating Kosovo, Albanians and Albanians, you know, all this is so primitive a theory that you should forget about it. But these ethnicities can be used to mobilize people's energies for fighting each other when other factors have caused the basic conflicts. And as I said, the conflict that led to the dissolution of Yugoslavia were, let's say, 20 years old before the first shot was fired in that Croatian village, Pakrac, that I just mentioned. So, so much for that wonderful, beautiful, fantastic, diverse place. I loved old Yugoslavia. I'm not ashamed of saying that. And I have lovely memories from so many intellectuals, so many meetings, so many challenging issues that I was part of, because, as I said, from 1974, I was a student at the Inter-University Center in Dubrovnik, Croatia, and later on became a teacher there for several years. So I can say I know Yugoslavia a little bit from the inside, so to speak, and that's also why I respect the complexity and I do not take sides between the peoples. They were all hit like, you know, a marriage that is running out of energy. But there were no lawyers and no psychologists and no decent mediators who could help them. They all exploited the situation, exported weapons to different sides, prolonged the wars and all that. Now, point 3, I could say, the framework for all this was the end of the Cold War. And the end of the, I should say, the first Cold War, because we are now in the second Cold War, started with NATO's expansion and all that. And we have a third Cold War coming up, being developed, formed now by the Americans against China. But we put that aside here. The first Cold War came to an end in 1989-90 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and all the relationships, you know, the tight relationships and dominance of Moscow over Eastern Europe. So the reason that we can look into this today is to say, what should we have done when the wall came down? The West chose to keep NATO even though the Warsaw Pact was gone. Anybody knew that if you asked somebody in NATO, which I did when I wrote my doctoral dissertation, I went down to Brussels and interviewed generals, officers and workers in the NATO organization. They all said, we're here because we want not to risk a war with Russia. We're peaceful people, we do not want a war with Russia, but we can't trust them, so therefore we have NATO. Now, the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact falls apart, and anyhow NATO decides to keep on and expand. The result today is that 10 countries that were Warsaw Pact countries are now members of NATO. That was a vital breaking of promises to Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, the last leader of the Soviet Union. Because all the important Western leaders, Germans, British, Americans, one after the other presidents, came to his dacha, his summer house outside Moscow and elsewhere, and told him 2 things that you must never forget, because that tells you how rotten and immoral the Western world has become since then. They said 2 things. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, we will not expand NATO 1 inch. We will not take advantage, that is, of your weakness, of your country's dissolution and the demise of the Warsaw Pact that we have always seen as an enemy. We will not take advantage of that. The second thing was, we want to unify Eastern and Western Germany. Those of you who are old enough may remember these were 2 countries split, and they wanted to unify. So they unified, and then they said, and if we do so, it will be a neutral country. You know very well it's not a neutral country today. You know Germany is unified and is not neutral. You know also that these countries with NATO expanding the whole way up to the border of what is today Russia, with an attempt even in 2011 or 12 to get Ukraine into NATO and the European Union. There's no way that can be done without Europe falling into warfare. But the Americans tried it anyhow with the regime change in Kiev and all the other things, of course blaming Russia for now being, you know, controlling the southeastern part and having annexed, shown aggression against, swallowed Crimea, which was all a reaction to that, among other things, because Russia has had a 33 years lease on what is its, I think, 2nd or 3rd largest naval base in Crimea. And it did not want to have its base in a NATO country. Surprise, surprise. So we should have closed down NATO at that time and say, with the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union gone, we have no enemy. We'll create a new system for security and peace in Europe, which was what Gorbachev suggested, and nobody listened to him. NATO has since then lost what the French call the raison d'être, the reason to exist. And they're now just inventing one stupid policy after the other to keep in business. Having started in 1949, promising the world stability, security, and peace. When you listen to Secretary General of NATO Stoltenberg, you hear nothing but, no matter what it does, we were for stability, security, and peace. And that is so bizarre Because if you look at the Treaty of NATO of 1949, you will find out that it's a very peaceful organization that says that it will work in conformity with, in accordance with international law and the United Nations Charter. Remember, the United Nations Charter's Article 1 says, peace shall be established by peaceful means, and the preamble says, war shall go. In NATO's Treaty of 49, the North Atlantic Treaty with America and the European allies, there is not a word about nuclear weapons. And it has nuclear weapons and has also the prerogative to be the first to use it even against a conventional attack from Russia, should it happen. And so you ask yourself, what has happened? What should happen with an organization that on a constant basis, day by day, violates its own charter, does exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to do? I think it should be closed down. And something new should be created, which is part of modern social life and politics. I say this because if since 49 you have not managed to create any stability, security and peace in your area, normal intelligence would make somebody say, well, maybe we should try to do something else. There's now a second Cold War. NATO, led by the US, insists on having new weapons, new military expenditures. Even the stupid idea that all countries, all member countries, must spend 2% of the gross national product on its military. I mean, this is bizarre because normal intelligence, again, would tell you we should have a defense in each country that is compatible with what we feel is threatening. It should not be based on whether our economy goes up or goes down. So if I sit in Sweden and Sweden's economy falls apart and is only half as big as it was, then it should go down to 1% or 0% or whatever. And if it suddenly doubles, then it should pay 4% or something like that. I mean, the whole idea of tying military defense to economic growth or decline is simply for intellectual dwarfs. It's people who've never been able to think. And this is, you know, we live in a society where we know the price of everything, but we don't know the value of anything. So off with that. It hasn't done any good since 49. What it did in Yugoslavia, and now I'm trying to tie the two things in, it did NATO. It did its first out-of-area operation, which was a violation of its own charter and without a UN mandate when it bombed in Kosovo and Serbia. You see, paragraph 5 in the treaty says that NATO exists as a kind of musketeer thing, you know. If one of the NATO members are attacked, all the others shall come to its help. It is in that sense, actually, according to its treaty, a defensive alliance. Collective defense. If Denmark is attacked, the other NATO member shall come and help it to survive and defend itself, if it cannot defend itself. Suddenly, in 1999, NATO decides that it should operate, you know, far away from its own membership countries, out of its own area, and not for defense, but to carve out an independent state of Serbia, which was an autonomous province of Serbia called Kosovo, now an independent state, recognized by some countries, but by far not by all, called Kosovo. The second Albanian majority state in Europe. I mean, they have Albania. So that took place after ethnic cleansings of the Serb population over 25, 30, 40 years out of the Kosovo province, where the Serbian culture has its cradle and its monasteries, etc. So they were looking for a new mission. And so one mission was to expand the whole organization into countries that were formerly the Warsaw Pact countries, and secondly, to carve out states. And it is now also engaging very much in what to do with China. You know, it's by far, it's gone far away from its original treaty obligations and the idea of what NATO was. An organization that does not follow its charter, its statutes, should be looked into by people of law and told to either stick to it or close down itself. So, the long story short is, we have a formidable organization called NATO, 29 countries, whose militarism military expenditures are so high that the recent few years it has increased more than the total military expenditures of Russia. Today, Russia being alone, not part of a new Warsaw Pact or anything like that, Russia is alone, one country, has 8% of NATO's 29 countries' military expenditures. When you look back in time when the Warsaw Pact existed, its military expenditures were between 60, 70 and 80, 85, 90 of NATO. So the West should be able to live much more securely because it has no enemy. Russia cannot be an enemy with 8% of its military expenditures. But still you hear every day that Russia is a threat. Just open any kind of newspaper in Denmark or Nordic area, Sweden or whatever. It's all constructed. It has nothing to do with reality. It's fantasy that serves the production of new weapons. And therefore, my humble idea is close it down or change it into, and that may sound strange to you, take all the weapons away from NATO, turn it into a humanitarian organization because it has a technology, it has a lifting capacity, carrying capacity of huge airplanes. Make it a humanitarian organization that can go in when COVID happens, when earthquakes happens, when refugees must be transported or whatever. But so that under the leadership of the UN, NATO could become a civilian emergency rescue operation without any weapons. Because it's clever people, it's well-educated people, it has high technology, they're obviously professional, and they don't want war also. I don't think anybody in NATO personally wants war or killing or use of nuclear weapons. So let them do something more useful for the future world instead of doing this stupid militarism for the past. I shall now return shortly to, and that's my fourth and final point, to the question of Yugoslavia. What did it mean? It split everything in a way no other country has, no other conflict in a country has in modern times. I would say Yugoslavia's dissolution, the way it was done, was much more fundamental for today's Europe than the fall of the war. Borders were changed with violence. That should never have happened. There should have been referendums and people voting if they wanted to split Yugoslavia. There was a concept coined which was humanitarian intervention. In the name of fighting for, human rights, the West came up with the idea that we can go and bomb because Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic has a genocide going on in Kosovo against Kosovo Albanians. That was, of course, not true, as most other accusations about genocide are not true. It was a police state. It was a harsh rule, but it was not a genocide in any way. And it divided Europe into, pro this and pro that side, where the European Union should have stepped in as a good mediator in a European space called Yugoslavia. Say, hey, we're not members of your different republics or Yugoslavia, but we would put our facilities, good offices, mediation and negotiation tables available for you guys in former Yugoslavia, all the nationalities. Come and sit in Brussels or wherever, Switzerland or where you want to sit, and let's talk about how the future Yugoslavia should be. Nothing like that was done. Actually, the European Union caused one of the wars in former Yugoslavia because they recognized, against the warnings of everybody who knew about Yugoslavia, including the UN Secretary General at the time, Perez de Cuellar, but the Germans wanted it. And I know a little bit about that history because I knew the German ambassador there, and he told me internally how this whole thing operated. Germany wanted to have a foot on Croatia and Slovenia, which they had also during the war, 1,100 wonderful kilometers of beautiful Adriatic coast and tourism. And They therefore, without a plan for the rest of this immensely complex country, recognized Slovenia and Croatia out of Yugoslavia, and thereby, I shall not explain it because that's too complicated and would take too much time, thereby caused the war to break out in Bosnia. Had the European Union not recognized Slovenia and Croatia, broken up Yugoslavia by carving out, recognizing 2 of 6 republics out of it as independent states, the war in Bosnia might not have happened. But they couldn't care less, they didn't know. By the way, I can tell you max 5 people in the Ministries of Foreign Affairs in Europe knew anything about the complexity of Yugoslavia. They didn't know there were minorities there, and they didn't know about the economy, they didn't know about the history, they didn't know about the traumas, had never read a book about Yugoslavia. So it changed Europe, I would say, more than anything else that has happened in modern times in Europe. It may sound strange to those of you who are younger than 2025. I would also say that it changed and split the peace movement. There were people who ran for the idea, including intellectuals like Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, Habermas, philosopher, etc. They all said, yes, go and bomb Serbia, they're bad guys. And the peace movement had the same split. Lots of peace movements could not agree on what to do with Yugoslavia. And the events in Yugoslavia, including, and I cannot also go into that, the massacre, not genocide on the Muslims in Croatia, but the massacre in Srebrenica, which was an absolutely awful and terrible thing, but had a complex background too. It was contributing to marginalizing the United Nations and its peacekeeping. This is an area where the United Nations did a formidable, very constructive job in Croatia, in Kosovo, in Bosnia, etc. I visited and worked with basically all the UN peace missions at the time, and peacekeeping missions. I knew the leadership of it, etc. I won't go into that. I know the qualities of these people. They were totally marginalized because the Americans and NATO wanted a military solution in Kosovo and Bosnia. So that was, of course, the UN and international law has been, squeezed out since the Vietnam War. But this was the moment when we could really see how the United Nations were put aside and the arms traders, the raw policies, the realpolitik took over and destroyed the country. Of course, with the help of those who carried weapons inside the country too. So I have very little good to say about the way Yugoslavia broke up. I'm not saying they were innocent themselves. They are very good at killing each other, and they're very good 2 weeks afterwards falling in love with each other. But the main thing is Yugoslavia ended so badly, and I don't think many of the republics have a better life today than they had, at least not with that diversity and that creativity and that originality as they had at the time. It all ended up in a tragedy, a Balkan tragedy, as one of the major books are called, about what happened and why it happened. And I'm very sad to see that there are no people today who are willing to reevaluate what we did, such as humanitarian intervention in the name of human rights, because that is exactly what we keep on doing in the Western world now everywhere, and scold China for human rights in order to legitimate a Cold War against them. And so I think we will see China and others coming in. They are very strong in Serbia because Serbia has been marginalized, kept out of Europe, and will be kept out of Europe in the foreseeable future. You may say that Yugoslavia and the people in that space lost the first round. Now Europe and the United States is losing the second round and final round. Yugoslavia was also the beginning of, marked one of the beginnings of the decline and fall of the West, and by no means has it strengthened NATO. It has shown NATO to be a brutal, one-eyed, unintellectual organization that could bomb and bomb and bomb for, I think, 78 days in Kosovo and not achieve its goal. It's shameful, and it should never have been done. There are many things that could have been done instead. The West chose to do its worst to the former Yugoslavia, to the people in Yugoslavia. And so, ending there, I would just say thank you very much for your attention. Read a little bit about Yugoslavia. Take it as a conflict resolution case, and you'll be amazed to see how much was done counterproductively out of ignorance combined with power politics, militarism, and arrogance. That's where we are today. It has hurt Europe. This wonderful space should have been part of Europe in a completely different way. And NATO should have been abolished long ago. And a new, basically civilian conflict resolution mechanism for Europe, for all of Europe, East, West, North, and South, should have been implemented. But NATO will exist, has no mission, but will exist and keep on finding enemies in order to exist. Look up. This is not the right way to go. And there is only one way to go, that is to rethink what security and defense and peace is. We still have time for that, but not with NATO. Thank you so much.